Ever get frustrated like when you're trying to make even a small change to an app's interface?
Oh, yeah.
And it feels like you're wrestling with this just monster made of code, right?
Yeah.
Well, so that's kind of the problem that declarative UI frameworks are trying to solve. And today's deep dive is all about understanding why this new approach is like taking the development world by storm.
Okay.
And we're going to be using this presentation by Thomas Kunith called Why Declarative UI Frameworks
Mm-hmm.
to kind of guide our exploration.
Cool.
So get ready for some aha moments as we go from like tangled spaghetti code to just these sleek, efficient UIs.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating shift. And it all starts with understanding how messy things used to be.
Right, like back in the dark ages of UI development.
Yeah.
So Thomas paints a pretty vivid picture of this in his presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dive into that old way of building interfaces.
So many traditional UI frameworks were relying on object-oriented approach, and they would build these interfaces as hierarchies of components. So each element on the screen was represented by some code, and all these pieces were linked together in this very complex web.
So it's kind of like if you're trying to build a house where every brick, window, and doorknob had its own separate blueprint and they were all tangled up together.
Exactly. To make even a small change, developers had to modify properties, manage callbacks for every user interaction, and keep track of references to all these different objects.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it was kind of a recipe for bugs, bloated code bases, and definitely a lot of developer headaches.
No wonder they call it spaghetti code.
Yeah.
So Thomas even includes this code snippet, I think it's on slide 6,
Mhm.
that shows just how dense and convoluted things could get.
Hmm.
And even I am getting a headache just looking at it.
Yeah, that snippet is a really good illustration of the challenges developers faced. You know, it highlights the tight coupling between data and logic,
Yeah.
the sheer volume of code needed for even simple tasks, and how difficult it was to understand how everything fit together. It's like trying to trace a single thread through a giant tangled ball of yarn.
Ugh, yeah. Okay, so that old way was clearly a mess. But didn't some frameworks try to clean things up by separating the UI definition from the actual code, like using XML?
Yes.
I vaguely remember something about that.
That was a popular strategy.
Huh?
The idea was to use a simpler language like XML to define the structure of the interface and then keep the logic separate.
Mhm.
This approach, as highlighted on slides 9 through 11, did make the code a bit lighter and UIs easier to design.
Okay.
It was even adopted by frameworks like JavaFX, macOS, iOS, and Android.
So that solved all the problems, right?
If only it was that simple.
Okay.
So while separating the UI definition was a step in the right direction, it didn't fully address that core issue. So developers still had to handle UI updates and changes manually, which, as shown on slide 16, meant a lot of tedious work.
I'm starting to see why Thomas calls it a separation solution that wasn't quite enough. So how did we get from this tangled mess to the elegance of declarative UI?
It required a fundamental shift in thinking. So instead of telling the UI how to change, developers started focusing on describing what the UI should look like based on the current data or state.
Okay.
And that's the essence of declarative UI.
So instead of giving the UI step-by-step instructions, you're basically saying, here's the data, now make it look like this.
Precisely. And the framework takes care of all the heavy lifting, like figuring out which elements to add, remove, or update to match that desired state.
Okay, now that's what I call progress.
Yeah.
That's like having a personal assistant that magically rearranges your furniture every time you just decide you want to change the look of your room.
Mm.
But how does this actually work in practice? I'm curious about the role of the virtual DOM, which Thomas mentions on slide 27. That sounds pretty sci-fi.
It is a clever concept.
Yeah.
And React, one of the pioneering declarative UI frameworks, really popularized this approach. So essentially, React keeps a lightweight representation of the actual UI in memory. And when data changes, it updates this virtual version first
Okay.
and then compares it to the real one.
So it's like having a blueprint that React uses to figure out the most efficient way to actually make the changes to the actual interface.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
By minimizing the number of direct manipulations to the real UI, React achieves much faster performance and smoother user experiences.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But React isn't the only player in the game, right?
Right.
What about Flutter, Swift UI,
Yeah.
and Jetpack Compose? Are they all using the same virtual DOM magic?
Each framework has its own nuances, but they all embrace the core principles of declarative UI, describing what the UI should look like based on state and letting the framework handle the how.
It sounds like this shift towards declarative UI is really gaining momentum.
Hmm.
What are some of the key advantages that developers are finding with this approach?
Well, as highlighted on slide 33, declarative UI leads to faster development cycles.
Hmm.
The code is cleaner and more concise, making it easier to understand and maintain.
Yeah.
And many frameworks offer features like hot reload, which allows developers to see changes in the UI in real time as they code. That's a huge productivity boost.
Wow. So it's not just about writing less code. It's about writing better code
Yeah.
and getting instant feedback.
Yes.
That sounds like a dream come true for developers.
It is a significant improvement over the old ways. And because declarative UIs are typically composed of smaller, reusable components, they're more flexible and easier to test.
That's great. It all sounds pretty amazing, but I'm guessing there are still some challenges and potential pitfalls, right? Nothing is ever perfect.
That's true. One of the biggest challenges is managing state, especially as applications grow more complex.
State management. That sounds a bit ominous. What makes it so tricky?
Well, in a declarative UI, the entire interface is driven by the state of the data.
Right.
If you don't handle state changes carefully, you can end up with unexpected behavior, like parts of the UI not updating correctly or data getting out of sync.
So it's like this delicate ecosystem where one small change in the state can have this ripple effect across the entire interface.
Exactly. It takes careful planning and a deep understanding of how state flows through your application.
Yeah.
But thankfully, many declarative UI frameworks offer tools and patterns to help developers manage state effectively.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's reassuring. I'm already starting to see how this declarative approach can really transform UI development. It's like a whole new way of thinking about how we build these interfaces. But Thomas also kind of hints at applying this approach beyond just UI design.
Right.
He suggests that we could describe the desired outcome of any complex process and let a framework figure out the steps. That sounds pretty revolutionary.
It is a thought-provoking idea, and we'll definitely be diving into that later on in our deep dive.
Okay, awesome.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's explore some real-world examples of how declarative UI is being implemented today. We'll unpack those specific frameworks you mentioned earlier, React, Flutter, Swift UI, and Jetpack Compose, and see how they're shaping the landscape of user interface development.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. So I'm excited to kind of delve into how different frameworks are putting declarative UI into action. We touched on React earlier and its innovative use of the virtual DOM.
Right.
That's been a game changer for web development.
Right, that blueprint idea really stuck with me. But let's talk about those other frameworks you mentioned.
Okay.
Flutter, Swift UI, and Jetpack Compose. They sound like they might be more focused on like mobile apps. What sets them apart?
You're spot on. While React really dominates web development, these other frameworks are making waves in the mobile world.
Okay.
They each bring their own unique flavor to declarative UI, catering to different platforms and programming languages.
Okay, so let's break it down.
Okay.
First up, Flutter.
Right.
What's the secret sauce that makes it so popular for mobile development?
Flutter is all about widgets. Think of them like building blocks for your interface.
Okay.
Everything in Flutter, from simple text and buttons to complex layouts and animations, is built using these reusable widgets.
So instead of writing tons of code to create each element from scratch, you're basically snapping together pre-built pieces.
Exactly.
That sounds incredibly efficient. But how does Flutter handle performance, especially with those smooth animations it's known for?
That's one of Flutter's superpowers.
Okay.
It has its own rendering engine that bypasses the limitations of traditional mobile UI frameworks. By controlling the entire rendering pipeline, Flutter can achieve incredibly smooth and responsive animations, even on less powerful devices.
So it's like Flutter is speaking directly to the hardware,
Yeah.
cutting out the middleman.
Yes.
No wonder it's known for its performance.
Exactly. And because Flutter widgets are declarative, they describe what the UI should look like at any given moment, leaving the how of actually drawing it to the engine.
Okay.
And this separation makes it much easier to create complex dynamic interfaces without sacrificing performance.
Okay, I'm starting to see why Flutter has become such a powerhouse in mobile development. But what about Apple's offering, Swift UI? How does it fit into this declarative UI landscape?
Swift UI is deeply integrated with Apple's ecosystem. It's designed specifically for building sleek, modern interfaces for iOS, iPadOS, macOS, and even watchOS.
So if you're building an app for the Apple universe, Swift UI is the way to go.
It's certainly becoming the preferred choice for many Apple developers. Swift UI leverages the power and expressiveness of the Swift programming language, allowing developers to build interfaces in a clean, declarative style.
Okay.
It's known for its intuitive syntax and its ability to seamlessly integrate with Apple's design principles.
So it sounds like Swift UI is all about making the development experience as smooth as the animations it creates.
Yes.
Okay. Now, we can't forget about the Android side of the mobile world. That's where Jetpack Compose comes in, right?
Yes. Jetpack Compose is Android's answer to the growing demand for declarative UI tools. It's designed to simplify and modernize the way developers build native Android interfaces. Compose is built from the ground up to embrace declarative principles, using a Kotlin-based syntax that's both concise and expressive.
So whether you're Team Apple or Team Android, there's a powerful declarative UI framework ready to streamline your development process. It's amazing to see how these tools are evolving to meet the demands of modern app development. But let's go back to those potential pitfalls we talked about earlier. Thomas mentioned state management as a key challenge.
Right.
Can you elaborate on why that's such a big deal in the world of declarative UI?
Remember, in declarative UI, everything is driven by state, the data that determines what the user sees on the screen.
Right.
As an application grows, managing that state can become incredibly complex.
It's like trying to keep track of all the ingredients in a recipe while you're juggling multiple pots and pans on the stove.
Yeah,
Things can get messy pretty quickly.
that's a great analogy. Even a simple app can have dozens, even hundreds of pieces of state, user input, network requests, data fetched from databases, and so on. Any change in one part of the state can potentially affect other parts of the UI.
So how do developers keep their sanity amidst this potential chaos? Are there any strategies or tools that can help tame the state management beast?
Thankfully, yes. There are several patterns and libraries specifically designed to handle state management in declarative UI frameworks.
Okay.
One popular approach is to use a centralized store to hold the entire application state.
A centralized store. Is that like a master blueprint that keeps everything organized?
Exactly. This store acts as a single source of truth, making it easier to track changes and ensure that different parts of the UI stay in sync.
Yeah, okay.
Frameworks like React and Flutter have their own state management libraries,
Mm-hmm.
and there are also popular third-party solutions that work across different platforms.
Okay, so it sounds like state management is something developers need to pay close attention to, but there are tools and techniques available to help keep things under control.
Yes.
But Thomas also hinted at another potential pitfall. Performance optimization. Isn't declarative UI supposed to be inherently performant?
While declarative UI frameworks do a lot of heavy lifting to optimize performance, there are still cases where developers need to be mindful of how they structure their code and manage their data.
So it's not a complete free pass.
No,
You still need to be a good developer, even with these powerful tools at your disposal.
absolutely. Declarative UI can make your code cleaner and more efficient, but it doesn't eliminate the need for good coding practices and performance considerations. For instance, you still need to be aware of how often your UI is re-rendering and ensure you're not doing unnecessary work.
Right, it's like making sure you're not constantly redrawing the entire kitchen every time you stir the soup.
Yeah.
So it's about striking a balance between the elegance of declarative UI and the need for optimization when things get complex.
Precisely. And as applications grow in size and complexity, this balancing act becomes even more crucial. But thankfully, declarative UI frameworks often provide tools and profiling capabilities that can help developers identify performance bottlenecks and optimize their code.
That's reassuring. It seems like declarative UI is a powerful approach, but it's not a silver bullet. Developers still need to be mindful of performance and understand the nuances of state management. But before we wrap up our discussion of these practical considerations, I want to circle back to that mind-blowing idea Thomas proposed,
Okay.
applying declarative principles beyond UI design.
Right.
Imagine describing the desired outcome of any complex process and letting a framework figure out the steps. It's like having a magic wand that turns your wishes into reality.
It is a tantalizing concept, isn't it? And we're already seeing glimpses of this in various fields. Think about self-driving cars, for example. Instead of programming every single decision the car needs to make, engineers are focusing on defining high-level goals,
Okay?
like navigating from point A to point B safely and efficiently. The car's system then figures out the optimal route, adjusts to traffic, and handles all the complex calculations and sensor data in the background.
So it's like giving the car a destination and letting it handle the journey.
Yes.
That's a perfect example of declarative thinking in action.
Yeah.
What other areas could benefit from this approach?
Well, the possibilities are vast.
Yeah.
Imagine applying declarative principles to healthcare.
Okay.
where you could define desired health outcomes and let AI-powered systems figure out the best treatment plans. Or in education, where you could personalize learning paths based on individual student goals.
It's like we're on the cusp of a new era of problem solving, where we shift our focus from the how to the what.
Yeah.
But let's not get too carried away with these futuristic scenarios just yet. We still have plenty to explore within the world of declarative UI. Before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one more crucial aspect: testing.
Okay.
Testing is often seen as a chore, but it's essential for building reliable and robust software. How does declarative UI impact the testing process?
Well, declarative UI actually makes testing much easier and more straightforward. Because declarative UIs are based on state, it's relatively simple to write unit tests that verify the behavior of individual components. You simply provide different inputs or states and check that the component renders the expected output.
So it's like having a set of blueprints that you can test individually to make sure each part of the house is built correctly.
Exactly. And because declarative UIs typically encourage the use of smaller reusable components, you can test these building blocks in isolation, leading to more robust and reliable code. In addition to unit testing, declarative UI frameworks often provide tools and libraries for end-to-end testing, which allows you to simulate real user interactions and ensure that the entire application works seamlessly from start to finish.
Okay, so not only does declarative UI make development faster and more efficient, but it also simplifies the testing process, leading to higher quality software. It seems like a win-win situation all around. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on something. We've talked a lot about the technical advantages of declarative UI, but do you think there's also a deeper philosophical shift happening here?
I think you're onto something.
Okay.
By focusing on the what rather than the how, we're not just changing the way we write code, we're changing the way we think about problem solving.
That's exactly what I was getting at. It's like we're moving from a mindset of micromanaging every detail to a more holistic, outcome-oriented approach.
And I think that shift has the potential to extend far beyond the realm of software development.
Okay.
What if we applied the same declarative thinking to other aspects of our lives?
Right.
Instead of getting bogged down in the minutiae of daily tasks, what if we focused on the desired outcomes we want to achieve and let the framework of our lives, so to speak, figure out the optimal path?
Wow, that's a powerful thought. It's like taking the principles of declarative UI and applying them to personal growth, productivity, even relationships.
Hmm.
It's about defining what we want and trusting the process to unfold.
Precisely. And while we're not going to solve all of life's problems with declarative thinking, it's a compelling framework for approaching challenges with a more strategic, outcome-oriented mindset.
This deep dive has certainly taken us on quite a journey. From the technical intricacies of UI frameworks to broader philosophical reflections on how we approach problems. And while we've covered a lot of ground, I think we've only scratched the surface of what declarative UI and its underlying principles have to offer.
I completely agree. This is a rapidly evolving field, and the innovations we're seeing today are just the beginning.
Yeah.
As developers and technologists continue to push the boundaries of what's possible, I'm excited to see how declarative UI will shape the future of software development and perhaps even the way we think about the world around us.
It's funny, we started this whole deep dive talking about building UIs. But this conversation has really expanded my thinking about how we just approach problems in general.
Mm-hmm.
It's like declarative UI is just one example of a much bigger shift that's happening in tech.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? This idea of defining the what and then letting the system figure out the how
Yeah,
seems to be popping up everywhere.
exactly. We talked about self-driving cars,
Right.
but think about those AI art generators that are all over the internet now.
Right.
You don't tell the AI how to draw every line, you give it a prompt, a desired outcome,
Mm-hmm.
and it creates something unique based on that.
It's a perfect example.
Yeah.
And it really raises some interesting questions about the role of human creativity in a world where machines are becoming so adept at generating content.
Right. Are we becoming more like directors guiding the creative process rather than the artists ourselves?
Yeah.
It's a bit mind-bending to think about.
It is, but I think it's important to remember that tools like these, whether it's a declarative UI framework or an AI art generator, they're ultimately extensions of human creativity.
They're empowering us to do things we couldn't do before, to explore new possibilities,
Yeah.
express ourselves in new ways.
That's a great point. It's not about replacing human ingenuity. It's about amplifying it.
Exactly.
And who knows what amazing things we'll be able to create with these tools as they continue to evolve.
It's what makes this whole field so exciting. We're really just at the beginning of exploring the potential of declarative thinking and its applications in different domains.
Well, I think it's safe to say this deep dive has given our listeners plenty to ponder.
Yeah.
From the practical benefits of declarative UI to the broader philosophical implications of this approach, it's been quite a journey.
It has, and I hope it sparked some aha moments and inspired our listeners to think differently about how they approach challenges,
Yeah,
not just in software development, but in all aspects of their lives.
absolutely. So until next time, keep those minds open, those creative sparks flying, and remember, sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to just focus on the what and let the how take care of itself.